Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Adult Bible Studies. I'm your leader, Wayne Williams, and today we're going to continue in a series of lessons from the Cokesbury Adult Bible Study materials, where we've been looking at different things that have to have an impact upon us as individuals to help us identify ourselves, to help know who we are. One of the fundamental questions that we all ask is, who am I? And we come to the definition of that through countless ways. So many different factors come together to produce the who we are. And last week we looked at Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, and we looked at how that genealogy, just like the one in Luke, uh, provides us a background of all the people in Jesus's family tree who uh, were a part of his heritage, part of Joseph and Mary, and part of the earthly natural family that he had. And so we saw there, we saw the highborn, we saw uh, the meek and lowly, we saw all kinds of different people in that lineage. We saw King David, we saw Rahab, who had been a harlot. We saw many people who, by faith and by trust and by claiming God's promises, were able to be a part of that uh, genealogy that led to Jesus himself and to fulfill the promise of God. That's what Matthew was really trying to show us here, is that God has been faithful to his promise through the sending of his son Jesus Christ. And he's fulfilling his promise to David, to Abraham, to countless others of the patriarchs and countless other of the Jewish people, that Jesus is a Jew and he is one of them and he has a heritage with them. And that's so important. And it was so important to the Jewish people of that day to be able to identify with Jesus. Without those kind of credentials, without that sense of his being one of us, uh, he wouldn't have been heard in the same way, if at all. And because of that, he it authenticated him and allowed him to get started and to do the ministry that God sent him to do. Well, that's one way that we come to know, who am I? We look at our family trees. My wife loved to do genealogy stuff. She had a computer program called Family Tree Maker, and she'd go back and research stuff. We even made several trips to uh, towns, and one town in particular in North Carolina, I remember, because she was a Henderson. Her maiden name was Henderson, and there was a whole clump of Hendersons who came as a family and migrated from North Carolina to Alabama. They came as a group, and several of them were given 40-acre quarter section kind of homesteads, and they all settled there in that same community together. And so that was an important place where we went and we found documents and found other things that linked those people and helped us to know who they were and where they had come from before that and all that sort of thing. And so for her, it was an enriching of her sense of family. The genealogy for Jesus is the same sort of thing. Today we're going to look at this idea of identifying through family and through other means uh, in a different way. We're going to go back and we're going to look at the story of Hannah and the birth of Samuel and see how Hannah and her faith and her husband and his faith, their family of faith, how their commitment to God started Samuel in the direction that he was to go. And we know Samuel was one of the great prophets. Samuel was the prophet who was right at the end of the period of the judges, right around 1100 BC. Right, he was responsible for ordaining the first kings. He had ordained King David, and he is a prophet who served at a crucial turning point in the history of the Jewish people. And last week, when we looked at that genealogy of Jesus, we saw how it was broken down into three parts: the part before David, the part between David and the Babylonian captivity, the exile, and the part after that. And so here we see that fitting together, and Samuel being one of those key people who was at that pivotal point where the history was changing a little bit. They were going from being a nation of independent tribes to being a nation under kings and that sort of thing. So, but anyway, that's enough to say about Samuel for now. But we want to look at Hannah, and we want to look at the basis from which this has an impact on Samuel. Now, where our text is 1 Samuel chapter 1, starting with verse 20. Prior to this, we find the story of Hannah, and she's married, she's barren, she's not able to have children. She goes to the temple and talks to Eli the priest, and she says, I wish so much for God to give me a child. And she said, if God will honor my request to give me a son, then I will dedicate him to the Lord's work. And Eli says, as God may choose to do, bless you and go forth and wish you well, kind of a thing. And then here she comes in verse 20, coming back to that. So verse 20. So in the course of time, this is after she's talked with Eli, she's returned home from Shiloh, where Eli was at that point. In the course of time, Hannah conceived. She was able to bear a child. She was able to conceive and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, which means, I asked the Lord for him. I asked the Lord for him. From even before he was conceived in his mother's womb, Samuel was dedicated to the Lord's work. Reminds us of a lot of those stories, doesn't it? John the Baptist, Jesus himself. Even in the womb, these key people have a sense of God's presence and power and pull upon their lives. Hannah, Samuel's mother, had such great faith that she dedicated the son that she was at that point not even able to conceive, and made a promise to God that she would keep. And go on here in verse 21, it says, when Elkanah, that's her husband, Elkanah, and all of his household went up to make the annual sacrifice and keep his solemn promise, Hannah didn't go. Now, this is a pilgrimage that Elkanah and his people made every year. They went to Shiloh. This, like I said, this is 1100 BC, so it precedes the Solomon and the building of the temple and things being moved to Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant at this point is being kept and taken care of in Shiloh. And this is a place where Eli the prophet was there. Eli was the main leader in that worship center. And so once a year, Elkanah and his people would go there, make their annual pilgrimage and sacrifices, and then return home. On this particular year, however, Hannah says, I don't want to go. I need to stay here with my son. And who knows what kinds of thoughts were going through her mind, but she was certainly not wanting to pull back from her promise to God, but she must have also sensed a desire not only to fulfill her promise to God, but to get to know Samuel in a motherly sort of way, to have that extra time. You know, one of the things I learned as a counselor is that first 3 years in particular in our society is a crucial, absolutely fundamental, powerful time in the life of a child. The stability that a child has or doesn't have in that first 3 years, the love that child has or doesn't have, the support, the positive feedback, the corrective, the mentoring, all that thing in that first 3 years is so crucial in developing that person into who they will be. Likewise with Samuel, Hannah, his mother, was aware of the quality time she needed to spend with him, and she didn't want anything else to get in the way of that. It's a beautiful story. I like that. So Hannah didn't go. Instead, she says, I'll bring the boy when he is weaned, she told her husband, so he can be presented to the Lord and stay there permanently. I will offer him as a Nazirite forever. a lot in that statement. You're going to keep him with her until he is weaned. And at this point, children were typically weaned at 3 to 4 years of age. A lot different than in our world, in our society, but nonetheless, 3 to 4 years old. And she says, I want to keep him here with me, and I want to have that. She didn't know it, what I know as a counselor about that first 3 years, but nonetheless, here we are getting that quality 3 to 4 year period in there of bonding and nurturing and of caring and providing Samuel with that substance that he needed to realize that he was important and he was of God. He had a calling from God. Uh, I'll bring him then. She's not reneging on her commitment to God, but she is substantiating that and saying, I have every intention of taking him to God. Now, another thing that we notice here in this statement, we haven't had a lot of background on this, but Elkanah was obviously aware of Sarah's promise, of Hannah's promise, and he affirmed that. He was supportive of that. He was the father. He had rights. Certainly in this day and time and in this society, he could have overridden Hannah's desire and told her, no, this is my son and he'll do this and he'll do that. But instead, he honored her commitment. He honored her promise to God. And so we have here an example of a faithful, loving mother and father who are both so committed to God that they're willing to even commit their son's life in this early phase. And certainly being the firstborn from Hannah, and Hannah being Elkanah's first wife, he had two, we're told. She was the first wife, and she had bore him a son, and so rightfully Samuel was his heir, his primary chief heir. And yet he's willing because of his, Elkanah is willing because of his faithfulness to God to honor Hannah's faithfulness to God. Isn't that a powerful story of how the people here are being directed by their love for God and their sense of God, and what is important is finding God's will and raising this child, assuming the role that they've been given by God to be the parents and to raise this child up. And then she goes on to say, I will offer him as a Nazarite forever. We've heard that term Nazarite before, haven't we? Where have you heard that? Well, in particular, we've heard it with Samson. Remember Samson? He was a Nazarite. Didn't cut his hair. He didn't drink alcohol. Didn't touch a dead body. There were several different prohibitions about a Nazarite. Did not do these things. And because of that, God's blessing came upon him in a special way. In Samson's case, it was by great strength and power. In Samuel's case, it is that prophetic connection to God and that ability to be God's mouthpiece and spokesman to the people. And like I said, turned out to be a very critical historical period for these people. Well, Elkanah goes on and he says, do what seems best to you. Now, there again, remember the society in which we're talking about. And this is a husband who is completely surrendering his will to his wife. And he's saying, do what seems best to you. This is my heir. This is my firstborn son. And yet I recognize you as a person of faith and a person of integrity. And I don't want to do anything to undermine that either. Stay here until you've weaned him, but may the Lord bring to pass what you promised. May the Lord continue to bless you and this child, and may God, as he has already brought this child into being, continue to nurture and be a part of the raising of this child. That's another important thing, isn't it? Elkanah didn't say, well, I'm a rich man, I can take care of him, he won't want for anything. But he didn't. He said, I have a responsibility as father. My wife Hannah has a responsibility as mother. And yet God is to be a part of this too. And may God be a part of helping you bring this promise to completion. So the woman stayed home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. Verse 24. When he had been weaned, he was still very young. Like I said, probably 4 to 5 years old. Uh, Falling on when she weaned him and whether they had just made a pilgrimage to uh, Shiloh or not. But when he's still very young, Hannah took him along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, a jar of wine, and brought him to the Lord's house in Shiloh. They slaughtered the bull, then brought the boy to Eli, Eli being the head priest. This was a typical offering in a situation like this. A 3-year-old bull was certainly a valuable animal, right at its prime. A great breeding stock, great uh, ability to be used for all sorts of things, great strength, great all kinds of other potentials within this animal. And so the gift of a 3-year-old bull was a big thing. An ephah of flour was also a big thing. It was more than just a typical gift. And the jar of wine is not what we might think about as just a bottle of wine. It was several gallons of wine. The jar was kind of a container, may have been a animal skin, it may have been a clay pot, but whatever. It was a large amount of wine. And so these were significant offerings that she made to the temple or to the tabernacle and to Eli, and shared with Eli her commitment and how this was to play out. When she gets there, she stands before Eli and she says, "Excuse me, sir. As surely as you live, sir, I am the woman who stood here next to you praying to the Lord." She starts off by reminding him of that we've met before. I don't know if you remember me, Eli, or not, but I'm that woman who stood here and was weeping and praying to God and pleading with God for a son. And you talked with me that day, and we prayed together, and you sent me forth with God's blessing. And I want you to know that as a result of that, I have conceived and I have given birth to this son, and I've nurtured him and cared for him to the point where he's able to be able to come and live here in the temple and to be a part of the work here in the temple and to be raised up to be a Nazarite and raised up to be a man in service of God. I prayed for this boy, and the Lord gave me what I asked from him. So now I give this boy back to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is given to the Lord. Wow. For as long as he lives, he is given to the Lord. A mother, a father, a priest, a community, all joining together in authenticating Samuel's call to be a special person in the eyes and service of God. And at this point, his prophetic abilities haven't shown up. I mean, it's a while yet before Samuel hears God calling in the night. But at this point, there's still all of this. What a great sending off this is calls for. It says, then they worshiped there before the Lord. They ended this. They completed the deal, if you want to look at it that way. They completed the act of the fulfillment of the promise by ending in worship and thanking God, praising God for what he had done. What a wonderful way to start a life. What a significant life the prophet Samuel and all the things that he did in his lifetime and in his role as a prophet to the people of Israel. What a great sending off. This calls you and I to stop for a moment and to think about our own lives, our own sending off. Yes, there may have been some people in our lives who were significantly negative and who kind of drew us away from being a person of God and being God's people, but there were so many others. Think about those school teachers. Think about those friends, people your own age. Think about mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers, those who were able to be positive, those who were able to, in love, show you what love means, those who were able by their own faith to illustrate for you opening your life up to God and allowing Him to be your Lord and your Savior. Think about the person you are now because of that, and give God praise and worship. Another addendum that I'd like to add to that is remember that you likewise are that positive influence and mentor and example to others in your life, grandchildren, children, nephews, nieces, neighbors, children at church. You have so many different possibilities to share and to be a Hannah, an Elkanah, a person of faith who trusts God and allows His promises to be fulfilled by joining hands with Him in the work of the Lord. May this be our journey this week as we look at who we are and how we came to be who we are. Let us give thanks to God for all those wonderful people He's put along our way and helped us find the way. God bless you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.